to start the timer.
Let's start now. Our society offers technology an ever-expanding role, so it's no surprise that video games are popular forms of entertainment. Maybe you can name a video game that you or those in your community like. As a creative writer, I personally marvel at video games' potential for engaging narratives. Additionally, I have an interest in mental health. Therefore, I was curious about how video games may portray different mental illnesses. In 2019, researchers at McGill University found that 97 popular games out of the 100 that they reviewed portrayed mental illness in stereotypical, negative ways, perpetuating the stigma behind them. This fact was harrowing to me, being a longtime lover of video games and a huge advocate of mental health. However, games can destigmatize mental health. As Dr. Rush, a professor of psychology and game design at Uppsala University, puts it, games can be immersive and allow players to experience what it's like to live with mental illnesses, contributing to the destigmatization of mental health. They can increase our self-awareness as we are the individuals in control of our achievements, as American Psychological Association researchers noted, and are designed to have narrative potential as our actions will drive the story forward. All of these strengths are great, but how exactly can games serve as immersive depictions of mental illness? The answer lies in the psychological fiction genre, which immerses viewers in the characters' psychological states. When paired with video game strengths, psychological fiction games can allow for an increased understanding of how exactly people with mental illness may experience their unique challenges by putting us in their shoes. To certify this idea, I needed to look at existing psychological fiction video games and their portrayals of mental illness. The Silent Hill franchise from the late 1990s into today has notably altered the psychological survival horror landscape, depicting different psychological conditions using a first-person point of view to immerse the player and allow them to better understand the characters. However, the more recent psychological horror game OMORI has been found to have similarities to Silent Hill in its themes of trauma, with one player writing, "I'm not calling it a blatant ripoff, but these similarities are too in-your-face to ignore, as both games are about coping with trauma in very similar ways." OMORI, however, focuses on the life of a 16-year-old boy named Sonny who contributed to the traumatic death of his sister 4 years ago. To attempt to cope with this trauma, Sonny will retreat to his dreams in isolation, or his headspace, which is primarily where the game takes place. It's important to note that Sonny experiences these dreams as a younger version of himself named OMORI, who has not yet experienced the trauma of his sister's death. At one point in the game, we can either keep Sonny in isolation or facilitate his recovery by allowing him to reconnect with his childhood. However, these heavy themes of trauma cause me to question how exactly this trauma-based game may also depict dissociative disorders, which are conditions in which individuals feel disconnected from their reality, usually as a means of coping with trauma. While dissociation is often a neglected field, the relationship between these disorders and childhood trauma has been suggested by the literature, leading me to my final research question. How might OMORI depict dissociative disorders given its focus on trauma? While the literature surrounding video games' depictions of mental illness is relatively sparse, I had to take influence from previous case studies in the field to answer this question. I chose to conduct a case study, or an in-depth analysis, of OMORI as guided by scholarly sources that also deeply analyzed video games for their portrayal of mental illness or related topics. Most of these sources were actually case studies of the Silent Hill games, with the case study I took the most influence from being Dr. Rush's case study of Silent Hill 2, where Rush played the game multiple times and made note of the different design elements that reflected realistic human emotion. She viewed the game as a multi-layered text from which she would analyze the many layers of the game's narrative and relate these to how exactly the game teaches us about human emotion. Another case study of Silent Hill 3 by a different researcher found that the game's design immersed its players in the characters' emotions and therefore allowed us to better understand them. When crafting my case study of how OMORI depicts dissociative disorders, I figured that, because of its lengthy gameplay, I would need a very clear set of criteria when taking notes that would constitute the game's different design elements as either relevant or irrelevant to my question. With this in mind, I created what is known as a dissociative framework based on the 5 proven symptoms of dissociative disorders according to the DSM-5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses. Amnesia, which is a severe forgetfulness of one's past, usually caused by traumatic events, would show up as Sonny not remembering key memories of his traumatic past. Depersonalization, or one's detachment from their sense of self, would show up as Sonny detaching from his feelings, while derealization would appear moreover as Sonny detaching from reality due to the symptom's definition. Identity confusion appears when Sunny perceives himself as somebody who's different, such as when he perceives himself as OMORI, his younger version, whereas identity alteration would appear as Sunny experiences a more childlike mind. With these criteria in mind, I took physical notes in a research notebook on the design elements that I found were relevant, playing the game's 2 different routes. After this, I simplified and categorized my notes based on the exact symptom that they depicted. To provide an overview of my findings from my case study, I found that most game areas depict different symptoms of dissociative disorders, that the game's 2 routes depict a dissociative individual's recovery process. I planned on reporting 4 different areas in my findings, but I found that one mainly depicted conditions that were related to dissociation, but not dissociative disorders themselves. So this is white space, the first area of the game that we encounter in OMORI. Composed of only black and white hues in a very small, limited space, white space creates a sense of monotony or plainness. It's nearly empty, and the sound that accompanies it is redundant and simple. There only exist a few objects, each of which I found to have some significant meaning. But what exactly does this mean? The hanging black light bulb here is described by the game to be the repression of an idea, evolving as, in one of the game's narrative routes, the main character will break it to represent his efforts to reconcile with his trauma and stop repressing his memory of it. Therefore, it depicts dissociative amnesia, the refusal of one's mind to remember as part of dissociation, especially when thinking of traumatic events. The main character's sketchbook inside of white space depicts childish yet very disturbing sketches of different eyes and watchful details, uniquely being an artistic expression of dissociation as corroborated by a study in which a psychologist observed the drawings of her patients with trauma-related adolescent dissociation when depicting their condition. The art in this paper appears very similar to Sunny's depictions of his mentality in art form, therefore serving as yet another example of trauma-related dissociation in adolescence. Sunny's laptop found in white space records each day, which is represented by question marks as continuously being okay, lacking enough detail as they each read, "Today I spent time in white space," or "Today I spent time with my friends, everything was okay." This lack of remembrance and vague, short description of each day depicts Sunny's dissociative amnesia as he's forgetting key portions of his days. The next area that we find in his dreamscape is headspace, whose pastel purple colors, lullabies, soundtrack, and allusions to childhood games and activities such as hide-and-go-seek, and lighthearted dialogue express how individuals with trauma-related dissociative disorders, especially adolescents, can regress into a younger version of their minds in order to cope with the trauma. Any allusions to the trauma in this area are obscured here, as Sunny's mind is attempting to suppress and erase the memories of it by immersing himself in these childlike dreams and mindset, yet another example of dissociative amnesia and, uniquely, identity alteration. A more reality-applicable expression of dissociative disorders is found in an area known as Faraway Town, which is the only real-life area that Sunny will traverse. It is accompanied by both visual and auditory hallucinations that he experiences, with more severe ones occurring inside of his home and less severe ones occurring outside. These at-home hallucinations depict his fears, which are shown as trauma monsters, and are therefore an expression of derealization, since Sunny feels parted from his reality audio-visually through hallucinations. He will attempt to attack these hallucinations with weapons just as he would in Headspace, while rather fighting a more child-friendly foe and further expressing his derealization. Outside, his minor hallucinations are carry-over images and scenes from Headspace, as Sunny hallucinates familiar childlike characters. In his home, he will act questionably, such as eating a raw microwave steak to satisfy his hunger, which results in him becoming sick. This is yet another expression of derealization, as dissociative individuals with this symptom often experience blurred lines between actions that are sensible versus insensible to fulfill needs, detaching from reality in the process. But aside from exploring OMORI's locations, it's also important to note that the 2 routes the game's narrative can take, known as the true route and the neutral route. To differentiate between the 2 routes, when we first play as Sunny in his house, Sunny's childhood friend will knock on the door and ask to hang out. This game will give us the choice to either open the door or repeatedly ignore it, and this choice will determine which route we will experience. If we choose to answer the door, we will experience the true route and join Sunny's friend in reconnecting with his childhood, reconciling with the trauma of his sister's death. While Sunny still hallucinates and experiences symptoms of dissociative disorders, these symptoms will dissipate near the game's end in the true route, expressing his efforts to recover. The theme of recovery through social interaction and reconciliation with one's mind in the game becomes a lot clearer in this route, as we are actively encouraged to piece together his memories and eventually break that symbolic light bulb of repressed memories we were introduced to early on in Whitespace. We spend significantly less time inside of his mind and rather manage his dissociative symptoms in real life, causing him in this scene to pick up a symbolic violin from his childhood and play it in his mind alongside his dead sister, representing his final reconciliation with the past. Hence, I refer to this as the recovery route. But suppose we choose not to answer the door. In that case, we will experience the neutral route and keep him in isolation, as Sonny lives a monotonous life and completes everyday chores when not dreaming. His hallucinations and other dissociative symptoms will not dissipate at all over time. Rather, they will increase in severity, representing his lack of recovery and the worsening of his symptoms. His character development in this route is significantly inhibited by his efforts to actively repress his trauma and refuse its existence. Near the game's end, Sonny, who is 16, sees himself strictly as his younger version here, who is 12, never reconciling with his trauma. This exemplifies identity alteration, as Sonny perceives himself as someone he was before he experienced the trauma rather than himself. Hence, I refer to this as the isolation route. All these findings led me to my conclusion. Through the game's various design elements and narrative structure, we can interpret OMORI as a complex, multi-layered piece of text that uniquely connects adolescent trauma and dissociative disorders. But what does this mean to the small field of video game analysis and trauma-related adolescent dissociation, and what are the limitations versus implications of my research? Through its use as a complex text, OMORI shines a light on the understudied topic of adolescent dissociation. The portrayal of dissociative disorders that it achieves allows for a greater collective understanding of trauma-related dissociative disorders, especially in adolescents. This enables OMORI to help destigmatize these disorders, bettering the reputation of video games' depictions of mental illness. In game analysis, especially of psych fiction games, this research broadens the methodology of game case studies by treating the game as a multi-layered text to corroborate Dr. Rush's work. However, my research did have its limitations. Because of OMORI's substantial mention of dreams as informative of one's mental state, it can be interpreted that OMORI places a heavier emphasis on theories of the unconscious mind, which states that our dreams inform our psychology, a concept that is relatively outdated and rather ignored in neuroscientific literature. As I did not interview the developers of the game in the time allotted for my research, I cannot be fully certain that they intended for OMORI to depict dissociative disorders, though I do know from a public interview that it intentionally depicts depression and anxiety, which are related disorders. While playing both routes of OMORI and searching for complex themes of dissociative disorders, I found other themes that, due to the limited time and length allotted for my research, could not report. However, I do believe that in reporting these findings, I could have added complexity to my research and to the small field of video games as portrayals of complex themes overall. Thank you.
That's a reflection.
Thank you, Shane. How did you determine which results generated by your research method were most important in informing your new understanding?
So, determining which results in my findings were most important in concluding, because there was so much information in the game due to its lengthy gameplay of 32 hours total both routes. There was a lot of information that I could have included that definitely represented more complex themes to support my research. But I really did, because I was focusing on dissociative disorders, I had to stay very strict to my criteria, my dissociative framework criteria that I described in the methodology of the 5 proven symptoms of dissociative disorders as per the DSM-5. So I had to actively seek out design and narrative elements that very deliberately, or not deliberately because I can't speak for the developers themselves, but very clearly represented those aspects of dissociative disorders rather than related disorders or conditions like depression or anxiety, because those are a lot more generalized.
Great. So I'm gonna pick a question from the reflection route. Think back of the initial curiosity that sparked your inquiry. What other curiosities do you have, and how has this process prepared?
At this time, 11th and 12th graders can begin to make their way to the main gym for the pep rally with their teachers. 9th and 10th graders should be going back to 3rd period. 11th and 12th may make their way to the main gym for the pep rally.
Sorry, can you
No
start
problem.
over?
So I'm going to start over then. Think back to the initial curiosity that sparked your inquiry. What other curiosities do you have, and how has this process prepared you to explore them?
So I'm definitely curious about how this sort of like case study analysis framework can be reflected in other forms of media, not just video games, and what exact information this can provide to how mental illnesses of all different types are reflected in media. Conducting this case study has definitely prepared me for the in-depth research that I wish to conduct in the future on like other texts for their portrayal of like different psychological concepts due to my interest in fiction and like human psychology. As a writer, it even allows me to deeply analyze and explore my own work as well as others' works of fiction to better understand how it creates an impact in terms of like looking at the human mind.
Thank you.
Could you please say a little more about how your findings provide directions for future research in the field?
Yeah, so my use of, or I guess my analysis of OMORI using the like idea that it is a multi-layered text that like Dr. Rush used in her case study of like the Silent Hill games definitely provides, I guess, depth to how the small field of video game analysis can like continue with their work, especially since with the like rise of technology and the advancement of technology that is becoming a more popular form of media. Different researchers who wish to analyze video games, especially for their portrayal of like unique mental illnesses or like psychological conditions, could use that like looking at it as a multi-layered text with different like design elements from different like scopes such as like audio-visual versus like narrative design versus like strictly visual design to I guess take in like what that means in reference to different criteria based on like proven mental illnesses and their disorders.
Okay, thank you.